You have to understand, this wasn't just a decision I made lightly. It was necessary for the—
When Elara Whitford entered the military tribunal wearing faded medals, the judge mocked them as flea market finds, while the room erupted in laughter. But when a four-star general suddenly walked in and saluted her first, the silence was deafening. What they discovered about her classified service changed everything. Hit like if you believe true heroes deserve recognition. Subscribe for more incredible stories, and comment where you're watching from. The administrative courtroom at Fairmont Air Base felt more like a hastily assembled interrogation chamber than a place of justice. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across metal folding tables arranged in rigid rows, while state and military flags hung motionless against the stark white walls. The eastern wing of the base had been repurposed for this hearing, its cold efficiency doing nothing to soften the weight of institutional authority that pressed down on everyone present. Elara Whitford sat in the uncomfortable metal chair, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She wore a simple navy blazer over pressed slacks, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun that spoke of decades of military discipline. Though few in the room would recognize it, the small collection of medals pinned to her blazer caught the overhead light, bronze and silver ribbons that looked worn with age, their colors faded to pastels that whispered of forgotten conflicts. Colonel Judd Harrington presided from behind the makeshift bench, his uniform crisp with fresh creases and ribbons that gleamed under the lights. His thin lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile. Though it held no warmth, Major Cole Ramsey sat to his right, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested this was routine business. Captain Marissa Doyle kept her dark eyes fixed on a tablet, occasionally glancing up with barely concealed amusement. Sergeant Trent Wallace leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already convinced of the outcome. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed off the bare walls. "This administrative hearing will come to order," Harrington announced, his voice carrying the authority of rank and the confidence of a man who had never been challenged. His eyes swept the room before settling on Elara with unconcealed disdain. "We're here to address irregularities in the service record and civilian contractor credentials of one Elara Whitford." Scattered murmurs rippled through the small audience, a mix of uniformed personnel and civilian base employees who had gathered to witness what many assumed would be a routine disciplinary action. In the back row, a weathered man in a veteran's cap watched silently, his lined face revealing nothing. Harrington's gaze dropped to Elara's chest, where her medals caught the light. His smile sharpened. "Those medals, Miss Whitford," he began, his tone dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Where exactly did you purchase them? Some weekend flea market?" Laughter bubbled up from the audience, nervous at first, then growing bolder as others joined in. Cole Ramsey's shoulders shook with suppressed mirth, while Marissa Doyle finally looked up from her tablet, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Elara's left hand moved almost imperceptibly to the edge of her blazer, fingers pressing against the fabric in a gesture that might have been nervousness, or something deeper. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, though something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but a carefully contained pain that spoke of wounds older than the medals themselves. "Colonel," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the murmur of amusement that continued to wash over her. "I'm here to cooperate with this hearing." Her words carried the precise diction of someone who had learned long ago to speak carefully, to measure each syllable against the consequences it might bring. The audience's laughter began to fade as something in her composure suggested this might not be the simple case they had expected. On the table before Harrington, a manila folder lay open, revealing documents with official seals and letterheads. At the corner of one page, barely visible to anyone not looking for it, was the edge of something unusual, a small triangular insignia, its edges worn smooth by time and handling. The camera of memory, if it had been there, would have noted this detail without dwelling on it, a visual whisper of something larger waiting to unfold. Elara's bronze star caught the light again as she shifted slightly, the movement revealing just enough of the metal surface to show 2 digits of what might have been a serial number, though the angle and lighting made it impossible to read completely in the back of the room. The man in the veteran's cap straightened almost imperceptibly, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his cap as his eyes fixed on Elara with sudden intensity. Something in her posture, in the way she held herself under fire, sparked a recognition that made him lean forward in his seat. At a side table, Carson, a civilian analyst with the bearing of someone who spent his days buried in databases and regulations, made a quiet note on his tablet. The procedural nature of the hearing was his responsibility, but something about the accused woman's demeanor suggested this case might not be as straightforward as it appeared. The institutional power in the room was palpable, the weight of military hierarchy, the assumption of guilt, the casual cruelty of public humiliation dressed up as due process. But beneath it all, in the careful way Elara breathed and the steady focus of her gaze, was something else entirely. Something that suggested the laughter might not last much longer. The morning sun slanted through the high windows of Hangar 3, casting long rectangles of light across the concrete floor where Elara worked. The space smelled of motor oil, metal shavings, and the particular mustiness that came from decades of aircraft maintenance. She sat at a workbench cluttered with radio components, her hands moving with the kind of practiced precision that spoke of muscle memory earned through countless hours of similar work. The vintage radio before her was a maze of vacuum tubes and copper wiring, its olive-drab case marked with faded military stenciling. Elara's fingers worked without hesitation, testing connections and replacing components with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood machines at a fundamental level. Each movement was economical, purposeful, the kind of methodical approach that had once been drilled into her through training that few civilians ever experienced. Coffee, Ms. Whitford. The voice belonged to Tommy, a young mechanic whose grease-stained coveralls and eager expression marked him as someone still learning the trade. He held out a steaming mug, the base's standard-issue ceramic bearing the Fairmont Air Base logo. "Thank you," Elara said, accepting the coffee with a nod that was somehow both grateful and automatic. As she reached for the mug, her body moved with an unconscious precision, shoulders square, spine straight, the kind of posture that civilian life hadn't quite managed to soften. She set the coffee aside and continued her work, but not before her eyes made a quick sweep of the hangar's exits, a glance so brief and natural that it might have been mistaken for casual observation. To most, it would have seemed like nothing at all. To someone who knew what to look for, it was the behavior of someone who had learned to always know her way out. Tommy lingered nearby, watching her work with obvious admiration. "You're always so calm," he said, adjusting a tool on the nearby workbench. "Like nothing ever rattles you." A small smile touched Elara's lips, though she didn't look up from the radio. The comment settled over her like a familiar coat, one she had worn for so long that most people, including herself, sometimes forgot what lay underneath. In the mess hall later, she moved through the lunch line with the same quiet efficiency. The serving staff knew her as a reliable presence, someone who said please and thank you and never complained about the menu. She carried her tray to a small table near the windows, where she could watch the daily rhythm of base life unfold. Supply trucks rumbling past, personnel moving between buildings, the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up on the tarmac. As she opened her small shoulder bag to retrieve a napkin, her hand brushed against something metallic at the bottom. She paused, fingers closing around a small object that felt warm from her body heat. Carefully, she withdrew it. A challenge coin, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The coin's design was simple. An eagle in flight over crossed lightning bolts, with text too small and faded to read in the dim light of the mess hall. She held it for a moment, thumb tracing its familiar edges, before tucking it back into her bag with the same careful attention she gave to her radio repairs. At the corner of her vision, she noticed Carson, the analyst from earlier, entering the mess hall with his lunch tray. Behind him, moving with the measured gait of someone whose bones remembered different decades, was the veteran from the morning's hearing, Raymond Keller. She had heard someone call him. His eyes found hers across the room, and for a moment, something passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement that went deeper than words. Near the entrance, a group of younger personnel discussed the morning's events in voices that carried just enough to be overheard. Their casual dismissal of that lady with the fake medals floated across the room like smoke, settling over everything with the particular weight that comes from being discussed in the third person. While sitting just close enough to hear, Elara's hand moved automatically to straighten a fork beside her plate, the gesture precise and economical. In the movement, Tommy's words echoed, always so calm, like nothing ever rattles you. But in the depths of her shoulder bag, hidden between receipts and tissue packets. A dog tag rested against the challenge coin, both items bearing serial numbers and inscriptions that told stories most people would never imagine. The afternoon light shifted, and somewhere in the administrative offices of Fairmont Air Base, computers hummed with the quiet persistence of systems designed to verify, cross-reference, and ultimately reveal truths that had been buried under years of classified protocols and bureaucratic forgetting. The revelation was coming, though Elara didn't know it yet. She simply continued eating her lunch, watching the world move past her window, carrying within her the calm that came from surviving things that most people never had to face. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm of institutional certainty, the kind of bureaucratic momentum that gathered force from its own assumptions. Colonel Harrington leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had never been contradicted by evidence he hadn't personally approved. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, creating harsh geometric patterns on the floor that seemed to divide the room between those who held power and those who suffered under it. Elara sat exactly as she had before, her posture unchanged despite the mounting accusations. Her hands remained folded in her lap, though her left index finger had begun to trace small, unconscious circles against her palm, a motion so subtle that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed. "The irregularities in your personnel file are extensive, Ms. Whitford," Harrington continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a pre-written verdict. "Service records that don't match Department of Defense databases, training certifications from programs that don't appear to have existed." He paused for effect, letting his words settle over the audience like dust. Major Cole Ramsey nodded approvingly, while Captain Marissa Doyle made notes on her tablet with theatrical efficiency. Sergeant Trent Wallace had adopted the expression of someone watching a mildly entertaining television show. "However," Harrington said, his tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for benevolence, "we're not unreasonable people here. Mistakes happen. Perhaps you borrowed some elements from your late husband's service record. Confusion and grief is understandable." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. In the audience, several people nodded. The explanation was tidy, face-saving, and allowed everyone to feel sympathetic rather than complicit. Harrington's smile returned, sharper now. "Admit that you've made some errors in your documentation, and we can close this matter quietly. Everyone wins. You keep your contractor status. Avoid any unpleasant consequences, and we all move forward." The offer was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never doubted his right to demand such concessions. It was an institutional machine running exactly as designed, grinding down inconvenient individuals until they fit properly into predetermined categories. Elara's breathing remained steady, but something shifted in her shoulders, a barely perceptible straightening that spoke of decisions being made. Her right hand moved to her jacket pocket, fingers brushing against the outline of the challenge coin she carried like a talisman. "No," she said quietly. The word fell into the room's expectant silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to reach every corner. Harrington's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Clearly, this was not the response he had anticipated. "I beg your pardon." "No," Elara repeated, her voice carrying the same steady cadence as before, but with something underneath it now, a foundation of certainty that hadn't been there moments earlier. "I won't admit to something I haven't done." The murmur that followed was different from the earlier laughter, more uncertain, edged with something that might have been curiosity in the back row. Raymond Keller gripped his veteran's cap tighter, his weathered face showing the first signs of something that looked like hope. At his side table, Carson found himself leaning forward, his analyst's instincts suddenly alert. There was something in the accused woman's tone, not defiance exactly, but a quiet certainty that suggested she might know something the rest of them didn't. "Ms. Whitford," Harrington said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I'm offering you a graceful exit from what could otherwise become a very unpleasant situation. Criminal charges, public embarrassment, loss of employment. These are not outcomes you want to risk for the sake of stubborn pride." "It's not pride, Colonel," Elara said, and for the first time since the hearing began, she looked directly at him. "It's truth." Something in her eyes, not anger, but an unwavering steadiness, made Harrington shift uncomfortably in his seat. Around the room, the casual certainty of moments earlier began to crack slightly, as if someone had introduced an unexpected variable into what should have been a simple equation. Carson glanced at the manila folder on Harrington's table, his eyes catching again on that strange triangular insignia, barely visible at the corner of one document. Something nagged at him, a half-remembered protocol, a classification level he'd encountered in other files that dealt with units that officially didn't exist. The afternoon light continued its slow progression across the floor, and in the mounting tension of the moment, no one noticed the small alert that appeared on Carson's tablet, a routine notification that a personnel verification request had been escalated beyond normal administrative channels. The machine was already beginning to turn, though none of them knew it yet. The administrative archives of Fairmont Air Base occupied a section of the building that most personnel never saw, a maze of climate-controlled rooms filled with filing cabinets, computer terminals, and the accumulated documentation of decades of military operations. The fluorescent lighting hummed with the persistence of systems designed to run continuously, casting everything in the flat. Colorless illumination that made time seem suspended. Carson sat at his workstation, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting off his glasses as he navigated through database after database. What had started as a routine verification request had quickly become something more complex, each search revealing gaps and inconsistencies that defied easy explanation. Carson, the voice belonged to Raymond Keller, who had appeared beside the analyst's desk with the quiet persistence of someone accustomed to being overlooked. The veteran's weathered hands gripped his cap, and his eyes held an intensity that suggested this was more than casual curiosity. "Mr. Keller," Carson acknowledged, not looking up from his screen. "Can I help you with something?" "That woman, Elara, her medals." Raymond paused, searching for words. "I've been thinking about them. There was something familiar." Carson's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. He glanced around the archive room, noting the few other personnel scattered at distant workstations, all absorbed in their own tasks. What kind of familiar? Raymond moved closer, lowering his voice. "The bronze star, the way she wore it, the spacing between ribbons. It reminded me of—" He paused again, then seemed to reach a decision. "Operation Warden 3. The name hit Carson like cold water. He had heard it before, references buried deep in logistics reports, classification codes that required special clearance to access. It was the kind of operation that existed in the shadows between official acknowledgement and plausible deniability." "You're certain?" Carson asked, his hands already moving back to the keyboard. "Certain enough to ask you to look." Carson pulled up the personnel file he had been reviewing, focusing on the image of Elara's bronze star that had been photographed during the initial documentation process. The medal's serial number was partially visible, just enough digits to enter into the search algorithms that governed military decorations. The system churned for several moments, cross-referencing databases that most users never knew existed. When the results appeared, Carson's breath caught slightly. "Classification level?" Raymond asked, reading the tension in the analyst's posture. "Above my clearance," Carson said quietly, "but there's metadata. Operation Warden 3 shows up as a linked reference along with—" He paused, checking the screen again. "Geographic indicators for classified logistics support missions. Eastern European theater. Approximately 23 years ago." Raymond's weathered face had gone very still. "She was there. Elara was Echo 12. Call sign. Logistics coordinator. But that doesn't tell you what she really did." Raymond's voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed events that would never appear in official histories. "She saved our entire supply line when the political situation collapsed overnight, kept us fed and armed when every conventional channel had been compromised." Carson stared at his screen, where fragments of information painted a picture that contradicted everything about the morning's hearing. The woman who had been dismissed as a fraud, who had been offered a face-saving admission of guilt, appeared to be connected to operations that officially didn't exist. "I need to make a call," Carson said, reaching for his secure phone. "To whom?" "Above my pay grade, way above." Carson's fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number that would connect him to verification protocols reserved for the highest levels of military intelligence. "This is going to escalate quickly." On his screen, the metadata continued to populate with fragments of information, unit designations that had been disbanded decades ago, geographical coordinates that had been classified beyond routine access, and most significantly, a personnel match that indicated Elara Whitford had not only existed in these records, but had been commended for actions that fell under permanent security restrictions. The system alert that appeared moments later was terse and official. External verification requested. Priority escalation to O6 command level. In a room several floors above them, phones were already beginning to ring with the kind of urgency that suggested someone's carefully managed day was about to become significantly more complicated. The truth, once set in motion, proved to have its own unstoppable momentum. The corridors of the command wing carried sounds differently than the rest of the base. Footsteps echoed with the weight of authority. Conversations were conducted in the measured tones of people accustomed to consequential decisions, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the tension that came from managing secrets that could shift the balance of global politics. Carson moved through these corridors with the nervous energy of someone who had stumbled onto something much larger than his routine administrative duties were designed to handle. The secure phone call he had made 30 minutes earlier had been answered by someone who spoke in the clipped, careful language of those who lived at the intersection of military protocol and political necessity. Behind the heavy door marked Command Operations, a different kind of energy was building. Computer screens displayed information that required multiple levels of clearance to access, and the personnel moving between workstations carried themselves with the particular urgency that comes from discovering that officially non-existent operations might be about to become very public. "Sir, we have a problem." The voice belonged to a staff sergeant whose job was to monitor routine verification requests for irregularities that might require command attention. What had started as a standard background check had triggered automated alerts at levels that most base personnel never knew existed. Colonel James Bradford, the base's deputy commander for operations, looked up from his morning briefing documents with the expression of someone whose carefully managed schedule was about to be destroyed by unexpected complications. "What kind of problem, Sergeant?" "A contractor named Elara Whitford. She's currently in an administrative hearing for falsified credentials, but—" The sergeant paused, checking his notes again. "Her personnel file has triggered security protocols related to Operation Warden 3. Bradford's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened with the focus that came from recognizing words that should never be spoken in routine conversation. "Who authorized the verification request?" "Analyst Carson, sir. But the escalation is automatic. The system flagged her Bronze Star serial number as connected to classified operations." Bradford was already reaching for his secure phone, his fingers moving across the keypad with the speed of someone making a call he had hoped never to make. 300 miles away, at the Pentagon, General Aveline Mercer was reviewing operational summaries in her office when her secure line rang with the specific tone that indicated a priority call from field operations. A four-star general with 30 years of experience didn't reach for such calls casually. They invariably brought news that would require immediate, decisive action. Mercer, the voice on the other end, belonged to Bradford, and his words were careful, measured against the possibility that careers and classifications might hang in the balance. "General, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. One of our civilian contractors is currently in an administrative hearing for credential irregularities, but her file has triggered protocols related to operations that fall under your command authority." Mercer's pen stopped moving across the documents on her desk. "Name: Elara Whitford. The system indicates possible connection to Warden 3 operations." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for Mercer to access memories that had been carefully compartmentalized for more than 2 decades. Memories of winter operations in territories that no longer existed under the same names. Of supply lines that had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Of personnel whose contributions could never be publicly acknowledged. "Echo 12, she said quietly. "Ma'am, prepare my aircraft, Colonel. I'll be at Fairmont within the hour." The phone line went dead, leaving Bradford to contemplate the implications of a 4-star general dropping everything to personally intervene in what had begun as a routine administrative matter. In the hearing room, Colonel Harrington continued his methodical dismantling of Elara's credibility, unaware that several floors above him, protocols were being activated that would transform his comfortable afternoon into something he was entirely unprepared to handle. The truth, it turned out, had its own chain of command, and it was about to arrive with the authority of someone who had never forgotten the debt that institutions sometimes owe to individuals whose service exists beyond the reach of official recognition. And the sound came first, the distant rumble of rotors that spoke of aircraft designed for speed and authority, rather than routine transport. It grew steadily louder until conversations in the hearing room began to falter, participants glancing toward the windows as if the approaching sound carried some message they couldn't quite decode. Colonel Harrington paused mid-sentence, his practiced rhythm disrupted by something that shouldn't have been part of his carefully orchestrated proceeding. The helicopter's approach was too direct, too purposeful to be routine base traffic. Elara remained motionless in her chair, though something in her posture suggested she was listening to more than just the mechanical sound of rotors. Her fingers had stopped their unconscious movement, and her breathing had settled into the controlled pattern of someone preparing for something significant. "As I was saying," Harrington began again, raising his voice slightly to compete with the growing noise, "the evidence strongly suggests—" The courtroom door opened, not the tentative entrance of a latecomer or the quiet slip of someone trying to avoid attention, but the decisive movement of someone accustomed to having doors opened for them and rooms come to attention upon their arrival. The sound of boots on the concrete floor carried a particular authority. Measured, precise, and absolutely confident, Colonel James Bradford entered first, his bearing suggesting that whatever was about to happen had been set in motion by forces well beyond the scope of a routine administrative hearing. Behind him came two officers whose uniforms bore the kind of ribbons and insignia that spoke of careers spent at the highest levels of military command, and behind them, moving with the controlled grace of someone who had never needed to announce her own importance, came General Aveline Mercer. The room came to its feet as if pulled by invisible strings, a response so automatic that even Elara found herself rising, though her movement was slower, more uncertain than the crisp snap to attention displayed by the military personnel present. Mercer's uniform was perfect in the way that only comes from decades of having such perfection be absolutely required. 4 stars gleamed on her shoulders, and her ribbons told the story of a career that had spanned conflicts most civilians never knew had happened. But it was her eyes that commanded the room. Gray-blue and utterly direct, they swept the assembled gathering with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. Those eyes found Elara, and stopped, for a moment that stretched beyond the boundaries of normal time. The two women looked at each other across a room filled with people who suddenly seemed irrelevant to whatever was happening between them. Mercer's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Recognition, confirmation, and something that might have been relief all flashing across her features in the space of a heartbeat. Then, in a gesture that transformed every assumption the room had held, General Mercer raised her right hand to her temple, in a salute that was both crisp and respectful, the kind of salute that superior officers gave to subordinates whose service had earned something beyond the normal recognition of rank. "Ma'am," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. Elara's response was automatic, muscle memory overriding years of civilian life. Her own hand rose in return, her salute precise despite the tremor that ran through her fingers. The room held its breath. Colonel Harrington had gone very pale, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process what he was witnessing. Major Cole Ramsey's confident slouch had vanished, replaced by the rigid attention of someone who had suddenly realized he might be catastrophically out of his depth. Captain Marissa Doyle stared at her tablet, as if it might offer some explanation for what was clearly impossible according to everything she thought she knew. Sergeant Trent Wallace looked as if he might be sick. In the back of the room, Raymond Keller's weathered face had split into the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. General Mercer moved forward with measured steps, her attention focused entirely on Elara. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that came from speaking truths that couldn't be challenged. "Elara Whitford served as Echo 12 during Operation Warden 3, she said, addressing the room but keeping her eyes on the woman whose service had brought her here. She maintained critical supply lines under hostile conditions when conventional logistics had completely failed." She paused, letting the words settle over an audience that was still struggling to reconcile what they were hearing with what they had assumed they knew. "Her actions saved the lives of an entire unit," Mercer continued, her voice growing stronger. "Including mine." The institutional certainty that had filled the room an hour earlier didn't just crack, it shattered completely. leaving everyone present to contemplate the implications of having spent their afternoon destroying the reputation of someone whose service had quite literally saved lives at the highest levels of military command. Colonel Harrington's comfortable world had just become considerably more complicated. The transformation of the courtroom was immediate and complete, where moments before there had been the casual confidence of institutional authority, moving smoothly toward a predetermined conclusion. Now there was the electric tension of people realizing they had grievously miscalculated their position in a much larger equation. General Mercer moved to the front of the room with the measured pace of someone who had never needed to hurry to establish dominance. She carried a leather portfolio that bore the unmistakable markings of classified documentation, and her presence seemed to alter the very air pressure in the space. Colonel Harrington attempted to reassert control, his voice carrying a tremor that he tried to disguise as authority. "General, while I certainly respect your perspective on this matter, we have established clear evidence of credential irregularities that—" "Colonel," Mercer's voice cut through his words with the precision of a blade designed for exactly such purposes. "You will suspend this hearing immediately." It wasn't a request. Harrington's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something that might charitably be called compliance. Though his mouth remained open as if he might attempt further argument, Mercer opened her portfolio with movements that spoke of ceremony and finality. The documents inside bore seals and classifications that most of the people in the room had never seen, and her handling of them carried the weight of someone revealing information that had been carefully guarded for decades. "Echo 12, she said, reading from an official document, distinguished herself during Operation Warden 3 by maintaining critical supply lines under hostile conditions when conventional logistics networks had been compromised by rapidly shifting political situations. She looked up from the document, her eyes finding Elara's face. She improvised solutions that kept operational units supplied with food, ammunition, and medical supplies for 17 days when all other support systems had failed. The room absorbed this information with the stunned silence of people watching their understanding of reality being systematically dismantled. Major Cole Ramsey had developed a peculiar gray color around his eyes, while Captain Marissa Doyle stared at her tablet, as if it might offer escape from the steadily mounting implications of their morning's entertainment. Sergeant Trent Wallace appeared to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit. "The operation was classified," Mercer continued, "because it took place during a period of political instability that required absolute operational secrecy. The personnel involved were sworn to maintain cover identities for the protection of all involved parties." She withdrew a second document from her portfolio, this one bearing the distinctive triangular insignia that Carson had glimpsed earlier, now revealed in its complete form and accompanied by authentication that could not be questioned. "This woman," Mercer said, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that ended arguments before they could begin, "is a decorated veteran whose service record was classified for reasons of national security. Her credentials are not irregular. They are restricted." The distinction hit the room like physical force. Carson, watching from his analyst's table, felt pieces of information clicking into place with the satisfaction of someone solving a puzzle that had seemed impossible moments before. But it was the personal recognition in Mercer's voice that transformed the moment from procedural correction to something approaching justice. "You maintained the Krasnikov supply route," she said, speaking directly to Elara now, her formal tone softening into something that carried the weight of shared memory. "When the political situation collapsed and our conventional channels were compromised, you kept my people alive through that winter." Elara's response came in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the absolute silence of the room. "We don't leave people behind." "Ma'am?" The words hung in the air like an oath, and in that moment everyone present understood that they had been witnesses to something far beyond the scope of a simple administrative hearing. Mercer nodded slowly, as if Elara had just confirmed something that had never been in doubt. "No," she said quietly, "we don't." Colonel Harrington's world had officially ended, though he wouldn't fully comprehend the implications for several more hours. "Duties, the transformation of the hearing room into something approaching a formal recognition ceremony happened with the swift efficiency that only military institutions could achieve when properly motivated." The harsh fluorescent lighting seemed less punishing now, as if the revelation of truth had somehow altered the very physics of the space. What had been a chamber of institutional intimidation had become something closer to a courtroom where justice might actually be served. General Mercer stood at what had been the prosecution table, her bearing commanding absolute attention, as she methodically laid out documents that would reshape everyone's understanding of the morning's events. Each paper she placed carried official seals, classification markings, and the weight of institutional authority that could not be questioned or dismissed. Colonel Harrington remained behind his makeshift bench, though his position now seemed more like that of an accused party awaiting judgment than a presiding authority. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the pale recognition of someone who understood that his comfortable world was about to become significantly more complicated. The assembled audience watched with the fascinated attention of people witnessing something that would be discussed in hushed conversations for years to come. Major Cole Ramsey sat rigidly upright, his earlier casual arrogance replaced by the kind of military bearing that suggested he was hoping perfect posture might somehow mitigate the scope of his morning's entertainment. Captain Marissa Doyle had closed her tablet entirely, her attention now focused on General Mercer, with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail of her own professional humiliation. Sergeant Trent Wallace looked as if he might actually faint. "The record will reflect," Mercer announced, her voice carrying the formal authority of someone making statements that would have legal and administrative consequences, that Mrs. Elara Whitford's service credentials are not only legitimate, but represent classified operations that fall under the highest levels of national security protocols. She lifted a document bearing the distinctive letterhead of the Pentagon's Special Operations Command, its surface marked with classification levels that most of the people in the room had never encountered. Operation Warden 3 was conducted during a period of extreme political instability in Eastern Europe, when conventional diplomatic and military channels had been compromised by rapidly shifting governmental control. Mercer's voice took on the measured cadence of someone presenting information that had been carefully declassified for this specific purpose. Ms. Whitford, operating under the call sign Echo 12, maintained critical supply lines that kept operational units fed, armed, and medically supplied for 17 consecutive days under hostile conditions. The details she provided were specific enough to demonstrate the scope of Elara's contributions, without revealing information that remained classified. Each fact she presented built upon the previous one, creating a picture of service that was both heroic and professionally executed. The improvised logistics network she established, Mercer continued, became the model for similar operations conducted in 3 subsequent conflicts. Her methods are still taught in advanced logistics training programs, though her identity has remained classified until now. Carson, sitting at his analyst's table with his computer, now displaying confirmation after confirmation of details that had seemed impossible that morning, found himself recalculating everything he thought he understood about routine administrative procedures. The verification requests that had seemed so straightforward now revealed themselves as the tip of an iceberg that extended into areas of government operation that existed far beyond his normal purview. In the back of the room, Raymond Keller watched the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone who had carried knowledge for decades, waiting for the moment when it could finally be shared. His weathered hands gripped his veteran's cap, and his eyes never left Elara's face as her story was finally, officially told. "Colonel Harrington," Mercer said, turning her attention to the man who had presided over the morning's character assassination with such confidence. "You will immediately retract all accusations against Mrs. Whitford. You will issue a formal, public apology. You will ensure that her personnel file reflects appropriate recognition for her classified service. And you will personally review your procedures for handling cases that might involve classified personnel." The list of requirements fell upon Harrington like physical blows. Each item represented not just professional correction, but the kind of career-altering moment that would follow him for the remainder of his service. "General," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "I had no way of knowing that the classified—" "You had every way of knowing," Mercer interrupted, her tone carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions before they could begin. A single phone call to appropriate verification channels would have prevented this entire situation. Instead, you chose to proceed based on incomplete information and personal assumptions. The rebuke was delivered with the precision of someone who had spent decades learning how to destroy careers with surgical efficiency. But there was something more than professional correction in Mercer's voice. There was personal outrage at the treatment of someone whose service had saved lives at the highest levels of military operations. "Ma'am," Harrington said, his voice barely audible, "I formally apologize to Mrs. Whitford for my errors in judgment and my failure to properly verify her credentials before proceeding with this hearing." The words came out like something being physically extracted. But they represented more than simple professional correction. They were institutional acknowledgement that the system had failed someone who deserved its protection rather than its persecution. Major Cole Ramsey, Captain Marissa Doyle, and Sergeant Trent Wallace found themselves called forward to face their own reckoning. Their earlier entertainment at Elara's expense now looked like exactly what it had been: the casual cruelty of people who had never learned to recognize service that existed beyond their understanding. "You will each submit written apologies," Mercer informed them, "and you will attend mandatory training on proper procedures for handling cases involving classified personnel. Your commanding officers will be informed of your conduct during this hearing." The three officers accepted their professional fate with the kind of resigned acceptance that came from understanding that some mistakes had consequences that extended far beyond the moment of their commission. But it was the final element of the formal recognition that transformed the moment from institutional correction to something approaching ceremony. Mercer withdrew from her portfolio a small wooden box that bore the seal of the Department of Defense, its surface polished to the kind of gleam that spoke of items reserved for significant occasions. "Ms. Whitford," she said, opening the box to reveal a medal that caught the light with the distinctive gleam of precious metal. "By authority of the Secretary of Defense, and in recognition of your classified service during Operation Warden 3, you are hereby awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal with classified citation." The medal was beautiful in the way that only military decorations could be. Its design, speaking of honor, service and sacrifice in the symbolic language that connected current service members to the long tradition of those who had served before them. As Mercer approached to pin the medal to Elara's blazer, the room fell into the kind of reverent silence that accompanied moments of genuine significance. This was not routine recognition. It was the restoration of honor that had been delayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control, finally delivered by someone with the authority to make such recognition official. Elara stood perfectly still as the medal was pinned to her blazer, her breathing controlled and her posture reflecting the kind of military bearing that civilian life had never quite managed to soften. When Mercer stepped back and offered a formal salute, Elara's response was automatic, crisp, precise, and carrying the weight of service that had finally been acknowledged. The applause that followed began tentatively, then grew as people throughout the room recognized that they were witnessing something that transcended the routine business of military administration. This was justice delayed finally arriving, carried out with the kind of ceremony that reminded everyone present why such institutions existed in the first place. As the formal proceedings concluded, Elara touched the new medal on her blazer with fingers that trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the emotional weight of having her service finally, officially, recognized by the institution that had trained her to serve in silence. The morning's humiliation had been transformed into something approaching triumph. Though the cost of that transformation would be measured in careers altered and lessons learned by people who should have known better from the beginning, the private office that General Mercer had commandeered overlooked the main courtyard of Fairmont Air Base, where the late afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch across tarmac that still radiated the heat of the day. She had removed her formal jacket and now worked in shirt sleeves, the accumulation of medals and ribbons on her uniform, speaking of a career that had spanned conflicts and operations that most civilians would never know had occurred. Elara sat in a comfortable chair that was positioned to catch the last light filtering through windows that had been cleaned to military specifications. The formal tension that had characterized their earlier interactions had softened into something that approached the careful intimacy of professionals who had shared experiences that civilian life couldn't quite accommodate. The office itself bore the temporary markings of someone who had arrived with little advance notice, but considerable authority: secure communications equipment, classified document containers, and the kind of organizational efficiency that spoke of systems designed to function under any circumstances. Mercer's aide moved quietly between tasks, ensuring that the administrative requirements of their impromptu operation were handled with appropriate discretion. "The Krasnikov route," Mercer said, setting aside a document that bore classifications most people never encountered. "I've read the operational reports, but I'd like to hear it from your perspective." Elara's response carried the weight of someone who had learned to discuss classified operations in the careful language that preserved both accuracy and security. "The political situation deteriorated faster than our intelligence estimates had projected. Conventional supply channels became unreliable within 72 hours of the initial governmental collapse." She paused, accessing memories that had been carefully compartmentalized for decades, now being retrieved in the presence of someone who had both the clearance and the personal connection to understand their significance. Local infrastructure was compromised by competing factions, each claiming governmental authority. Traditional logistics protocols assumed stable transportation networks and cooperative local officials. Elara's voice took on the precise cadence of someone who had learned to brief senior officers under circumstances where accuracy could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "So you improvised," Mercer said, though her tone suggested this was confirmation rather than question. "We adapted our approach to match the realities on the ground. Small, dispersed supply caches rather than centralized distribution points. Local procurement using multiple competing vendors rather than single-source contracts. Movement schedules that varied daily, rather than following predictable patterns." The technical details she provided painted a picture of logistics operations conducted under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced supply officers, executed by someone who understood both the theoretical frameworks and the practical realities of keeping people alive in hostile environments. Mercer nodded slowly, her expression carrying the recognition of someone who understood exactly how difficult such operations would have been to execute. The weather conditions alone should have made it impossible. Temperatures that regularly dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, local heating infrastructure compromised by political instability, supply routes that had to be altered daily to avoid areas controlled by hostile factions. Elara's voice remained steady as she recounted conditions that had tested every aspect of her training and experience. "But you maintained full operational capability for the entire unit," Mercer said, consulting notes that carried the authority of official documentation. 67 personnel, no casualties related to supply shortages, no mission degradation due to logistical failures, 17 days of operations under conditions that conventional wisdom said couldn't be sustained for 17 hours. The achievement was stated with the kind of understated precision that characterized military professionals discussing their work, but the scope of what had been accomplished was unmistakable. This had not been routine logistics support. It had been operational artistry executed under circumstances that would have defeated less capable personnel. Mercer reached into her desk drawer and withdrew an envelope that bore the distinctive seals of the Department of Defense's highest administrative levels. The paper was heavy, formal, and carried the weight of institutional recognition that had been delayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. "The Classified Service Recognition Board convened last month to review operations from your time period," she said, extending the envelope toward Elara. "Your service has been formally recognized at levels that reflect its actual contribution to mission success." Elara accepted the envelope with the same careful precision that characterized everything she did, but she didn't open it immediately. Some documents required appropriate ceremony, and this moment felt too significant for casual examination. "There's something else," Mercer continued, her tone shifting to something that carried both professional opportunity and personal invitation. "The Strategic Support Command is developing new protocols for logistics operations in politically unstable environments. We're establishing a consulting board of personnel with relevant experience." The offer hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond simple employment. This was recognition, restoration, and the opportunity to contribute again to operations that would matter at the highest levels of national security. The position would be classified, obviously, but it would allow you to shape how the next generation of logistics personnel are trained to handle the kind of situations you navigated during Warden 3. Mercer's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who had found the right person for work that needed to be done. Your experience with improvised supply networks under hostile conditions is exactly what our current doctrine lacks. We're preparing for a world where conventional assumptions about infrastructure and political stability may not apply. Elara set the unopened envelope on the small table beside her chair, her movements deliberate as she considered an offer that would transform her careful civilian existence into something that engaged capabilities she had thought might never be needed again. The compensation would reflect appropriate recognition for your expertise, Mercer added, though her tone suggested that financial considerations were secondary to the opportunity to serve again in ways that would matter. And the operational security requirements, Elara asked, demonstrating the kind of practical thinking that had made her effective in classified operations. Similar to your previous service, compartmentalized access, need-to-know protocols, regular clearance renewals. You would be briefed into current operations at levels appropriate to your consulting responsibilities. The conversation continued as the afternoon light gradually faded, two professionals discussing work that would shape how future operations were conducted in an increasingly unstable world. But beneath the technical details was something more personal, the recognition that some people were uniquely qualified for work that others couldn't even imagine. Carson appeared in the doorway with documentation that would officially restore Elara's service record to its proper status. General, the personnel file updates are complete. All previous annotations regarding credential irregularities have been removed and replaced with appropriate classified service recognition. Mercer accepted the documents with satisfaction, then turned back to Elara. You have some decisions to make, but whatever you choose, your service has never been forgotten by the people who mattered. Outside the window, the base continued its daily rhythms. But something fundamental had shifted. Truth had been revealed. Honor had been restored. And opportunities had been offered that would allow decades of hard-won experience to contribute to missions that would matter. The bronze star on Elara's blazer caught the last light of the afternoon, and for the first time in years, it gleamed with the recognition it had always deserved. The evening light at Fairmont Air Base carried that particular quality that transformed even the most utilitarian military architecture into something approaching beauty. Shadows stretched long across the main courtyard, where aircraft sat in patient rows awaiting their next missions, and the distant sound of engines warming up provided a constant undertone that spoke of the eternal rhythm of military operations continuing regardless of the day's dramatic revelations. Elara walked slowly across the tarmac, her steps measured and deliberate, as she processed everything that had transformed her carefully managed civilian existence into something she was still learning to understand. The weight of the morning's humiliation had been replaced by something more complex, not simple relief, but the profound satisfaction of having survived institutional persecution and emerged with her dignity not only intact, but officially recognized. The new medal on her blazer caught the light as she moved, its presence serving as tangible evidence that the nightmare of bureaucratic dismissal had been transformed into something approaching vindication. But more than the physical recognition was the restoration of her sense of place in the world, the understanding that her service had mattered, that her contributions had been significant, and that her value had never been diminished by others' failure to recognize it. Personnel moved around her with the usual efficiency of a military installation, but the subtle changes in their behavior were unmistakable. Word traveled fast on military bases, and by now, virtually everyone on Fairmont knew that the woman they might have dismissed that morning was someone whose service had earned the personal intervention of a 4-star general. The transformation from invisible contractor to recognized veteran had happened with the swift efficiency that only institutional authority could achieve. Near the entrance to the main administrative building, a small group had gathered, not the hostile audience of the morning's hearing, but people who had come to offer the kind of recognition that came from understanding what they had witnessed. Carson waited with his patient bearing, holding documentation that would ensure her personnel record reflected appropriate recognition for service that had been hidden for far too long. "Ms. Whitford," he said as she approached, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the bureaucratic courtesy of their earlier interactions. "I wanted to personally thank you for your patience during this morning's difficulties. Elara accepted the folder he offered with the same careful precision that characterized all her interactions, but her response carried warmth that hadn't been present during their official exchanges. "You did exactly what you should have done, Carson. You investigated when something didn't make sense, and you escalated when you found information that was beyond your authority to handle." "Eventually," he said. There was something in his voice that suggested he had learned lessons about the importance of proper verification procedures that would influence how he approached such situations for the remainder of his career. "Eventually is what mattered," she replied. "The system worked the way it was supposed to work." Raymond Keller approached from across the courtyard with the deliberate gait of someone whose bones remembered different decades, but whose spirit remained sharp. The veteran's face showed the kind of deep satisfaction that came from witnessing justice delayed finally arriving, and his bearing carried the dignity of someone who had kept faith with memories that others had forgotten. "Echo 12, he said quietly, using her old call sign with the familiarity earned through shared service in operations that officially didn't exist. "Ranger," she replied, recognizing him now with the clarity that came from having their shared history officially acknowledged rather than buried under layers of necessary secrecy. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had served in ways that civilian life couldn't quite accommodate, watching the daily rhythm of military life continue around them, while processing the significance of having their contributions finally recognized by the institutions that had trained them to serve, without expectation of acknowledgement. "I never forgot," Raymond said simply, "what you did that winter, how you kept us going when everything else had fallen apart." "We don't leave people behind," Elara replied, the words carrying the weight of an oath that had shaped decades of decisions and sacrifices. "No," he agreed, "we don't." General Mercer appeared at the entrance to the administrative building, her presence causing the usual straightening of postures and quickening of pace that accompanied high-ranking officers. But her attention was focused entirely on Elara. She carried herself with the satisfaction of someone who had completed important business, and when she approached, her bearing reflected both professional accomplishment and personal satisfaction. "The Strategic Support Command position," she said without preamble, extending an official document that bore the seals and classifications of work that would engage capabilities Elara had thought might never be needed again. "The paperwork can be processed within the week if you're interested." Elara looked out across the courtyard where aircraft sat in precise rows, their silhouettes sharp against the evening sky. The offer represented more than employment. It was restoration of purpose, official recognition of expertise, and the opportunity to contribute again to operations that would matter at the highest levels of national security. "The consulting board meets monthly at the Pentagon," Mercer continued. "But most of the work can be done remotely. You would be reviewing proposed logistics protocols, training curricula, and operational plans for environments where conventional assumptions about infrastructure and political stability may not apply." The description painted a picture of work that would draw upon everything Elara had learned during her classified service, applying hard-won experience to shape how future operations would be conducted in an increasingly complex world. "Your experience with improvised supply networks under hostile conditions is exactly what our current doctrine lacks," Mercer added. "We're preparing for scenarios where the kind of adaptability you demonstrated during Warden 3 might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." Elara touched the challenge coin in her pocket, feeling its familiar weight and texture as she considered an offer that would transform her careful civilian existence into something that engaged capabilities she had maintained through years of private discipline and silent preparation. "Sometimes you need air support," Mercer said quietly, echoing a conversation from decades earlier when roles had been different, but the fundamental trust between military professionals had been the same. Elara smiled slightly, her response carrying the weight of shared memory and the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving operations that tested every aspect of training, experience, and personal resilience. "And sometimes the protection comes from the ground." The words hung in the evening air between them, carrying layers of meaning that spoke to the complex relationship between support and combat operations, between those who fought and those who kept them supplied, between recognition and service that existed beyond the reach of public acknowledgement as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the base in shades of gold and amber. that made even military architecture look momentarily beautiful. Elara Whitford walked across Fairmont Air Base with the quiet dignity of someone whose worth had finally been seen by the institution that had trained her to serve in silence. Her service record would now reflect appropriate recognition for contributions that had shaped how logistics operations were conducted at the highest levels of military command. Her future offered opportunities to contribute again to work that would matter in ways that most people would never know. And her past would no longer be a source of shame or institutional dismissal, but a foundation for pride and continued service. The bronze star on her blazer caught the last light of the day, and in that gleam was the promise that some truths, no matter how deeply buried under layers of necessary classification and bureaucratic indifference, would eventually find their way to the surface when the right people possessed both the authority and the will to seek them. The challenge coin in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth as she walked, a small piece of metal that carried the weight of service, sacrifice, and the recognition that some debts could only be acknowledged. Never fully repaid, but acknowledgement, she had learned, was enough. More than enough when it came from people who understood what such service cost and why it mattered. The truth, as it turned out, had its own chain of command, and it answered to no one but itself. But when wielded by those with the authority and integrity to seek it, truth possessed the power to transform persecution into recognition, humiliation into honor, and forgotten service into lasting legacy. Sometimes the most profound courage isn't found in dramatic gestures or public heroics, but in the quiet persistence of those who serve without recognition, maintaining their integrity while waiting for the moment when their contributions might finally be acknowledged by those with the wisdom to see beyond surface appearances. Would you like another story?